The Gulf was a sheet of hammered silver under the Florida sun. Jack Rourke adjusted the mask on Old Man Hemming's face, the retiree beaming with nervous excitement. 3 college kids, reeking of sunscreen and cheap beer, bobbed alongside the boat, their laughter already slurring at 11 in the morning. Spring break. Jack had learned to tolerate it, mostly. "Remember what I told you," he said, his voice amplified by the small waterproof headset. "Equalize early and often, no sudden movements, and for God's sake, don't touch anything." Hemmings gave a thumbs up, a little too enthusiastic. The kids just grinned. Jack ran through the safety briefing one last time, the practiced calm, a carefully constructed shield. He didn't need enthusiasm, just efficiency. He'd seen what happened when things went wrong. He back-rolled into the water, the shock momentarily stealing his breath. The turquoise depth swallowed him whole, the sun fracturing into dancing beams. This was the good part. Below the surface, the noise vanished, replaced by the rhythmic hush of his regulator and the vibrant life of the reef. He led the group along a coral head, pointing out a nurse shark slumbering in a cave, a school of shimmering jacks, a moray eel peering from its lair. He moved with a grace that came from years of practice, years that stretched back further than anyone here knew. It wasn't just about being a dive instructor. It was about control, about being aware of every current, every potential threat. Old habits died hard. A quick glance back confirmed everyone was okay. Hemmings fumbled with his buoyancy compensator, rising a little too fast, and Jack gently steered him back down, a reassuring touch on his tank. The kids, surprisingly, were following instructions, their initial bravado replaced with wide-eyed wonder. For an hour he was just Jack Rourke, the dive instructor. It was a good life, a quiet life, a life he'd built from the wreckage of another. The cold crept in slowly, not from the water, but from inside his bones. He was no longer in the Gulf, but in the frigid, black expanse of the Atlantic, the beam of his underwater flashlight cutting through the murky depths, not searching for colorful fish, but for something else. The image flickered. A metal shipping container, half buried in the sand. He remembered the weightlessness, the oppressive darkness, the metallic tang of blood. The radio crackled with static, then a frantic voice. "Rourke, we have contact. Repeat, we have contact." He saw Agent Davies' face, contorted in a silent scream behind her mask. Then, a blinding flash, an explosion, the container imploding, and Davies gone. He and his team had been so sure, a major smuggling operation funneling arms to a terrorist cell. They'd had intel, a location, everything pointing to a swift, clean takedown, but something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. He hadn't been able to save her. He hadn't been able to save anyone. The memory slammed into him, a physical blow. He surfaced, gasping for air, the bright Florida sun a brutal contrast to the darkness he'd just inhabited. The tourists were climbing back onto the boat, chattering excitedly about the reef. He forced a smile. "Good dive, everyone." Hemmings slapped him on the back. "Best one I've ever had, son. You're a natural." A natural at what? At pretending, at burying the ghosts. He killed the engine and started the slow ride back to the marina, the weight of the past settling on his shoulders like a lead diver's belt. The change came swiftly. The turquoise sky darkened, bruised purple clouds gathering. The air, thick and humid just moments before, now carried a sharp, electric charge. The wind picked up, whipping the water into a frenzy. Old Man Fitzwilliam, who ran the bait shop on the dock, was already securing everything. "Storm coming," he rasped, his face weathered like driftwood. "Looks like a big one." Jack glanced at the radar on his boat. Fitzwilliam was right. A line of red was creeping closer, indicating a severe storm system. Every and off the water, he shouted to the other dive operators, his voice barely audible above the rising wind. Now, boats scrambled for the marina, desperate to reach safety. Before the storm hit, Jack secured his own vessel, the Sea Serpent, and helped a few of the less experienced divers tie up, the spray stinging his face. Within an hour, the storm unleashed its fury. Rain lashed down in sheets, visibility dropped to zero, and the wind howled like a banshee. The marina transformed into a chaotic mess of rocking boats, snapping lines, and panicked shouts. He watched from the small office of the dive shop, the windows rattling in their frames. Fitzwilliam was inside, sipping lukewarm coffee and muttering about the capriciousness of the Gulf. "Seen a lot of storms in my time," Fitzwilliam said, without looking up, "but not many like this one." He paused, then added, a strange glint in his eye. "They say storms like these, they wake up the old ones." "Old ones?" Jack asked, trying to sound disinterested. Fitzwilliam chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "The ghost fleet, you ever hear tell of it?" Jack shook his head. "Legend says there is a whole graveyard of ships out there, sunk over the centuries. Spanish galleons laden with gold, pirate ships, even some from the Civil War. They say the wrecks shift during storms, sometimes even show themselves briefly, before disappearing again. Sailors used to claim they saw ghostly lights and heard the cries of drowned men." "Just stories, Fitz," Jack said, but even to his own ears it sounded unconvincing. Old sailors' tales always held a grain of truth. Maybe, maybe not. But this Gulf, it keeps its secrets, son, and sometimes those secrets want to be found. He gestured to the raging storm outside. "Tonight, she is kicking up a whole lot of history." The phone rang, startling him. It was an old, brick-like cell phone he rarely used, kept for emergencies. He hadn't given the number to anyone in his new life. He glanced at the caller, ID, unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Rourke." A voice raspy and strained crackled through the line. "Jack, is that you?" He recognized it instantly. His stomach twisted into a knot. "Daniel, thank God. I need your help." Daniel, his older brother, the one he hadn't spoken to in 5 years, the one he'd actively avoided. "What is it?" Jack asked, his voice tight. "It is about Dad and the Foundation. They're digging around, asking questions. Things are complicated." "What kind of questions?" Daniel hesitated. "About the Lisbon operation. About what happened." Jack's grip tightened on the phone. Lisbon, the operation that had ended his career. The operation that had cost Agent Davies her life. The operation that had shattered his family. "What do you want me to do?" Jack asked, knowing he shouldn't, knowing he was already walking into a trap. "Just come home, Jack, please. I can't handle this alone. I told you. I'm done with that life. This isn't about that life, Jack. This is about Dad, about protecting what he built on lies and cover-ups." The line went silent for a moment. "Just come home," Daniel repeated, his voice laced with desperation, "before it is too late." He was about to refuse, to sever the connection and return to his carefully constructed peace, when Fitzwilliam burst into the office, his face pale and wide-eyed. "Jack, you gotta see this." Jack followed him out into the storm. The rain blinding, the wind nearly knocking him off his feet. Fitzwilliam pointed towards the churning sea. "Beyond the harbour entrance, look." Through the deluge, Jack saw it, a dark shape rising and falling in the monstrous waves. It wasn't a rogue wave or debris from a damaged boat. It was a wreck, a large one, but it wasn't on any charts. It hadn't been there before. "What in God's name?" Jack breathed, a cold dread creeping into his heart. The storm surged, and for a brief, terrifying moment, The waves parted, revealing more of the wreck. A splintered mast, a decaying hull, and something else. Looming shape within the wreckage, barely visible through the rain and the waves. It looked like a submerged vessel, larger than any fishing boat, and impossibly, unmistakably ancient. Suddenly, a new, sharper fear eclipsed everything else. He wasn't sure what the wreck was, but he knew, with a sickening certainty, that his carefully constructed peace was over. The storm had moved on, leaving behind a bruised sky and a restless sea. The marina was a chaotic mess of splintered wood and tangled lines, but the immediate danger had passed. Though the Coast Guard had issued a small craft advisory, Jack couldn't shake the image of the wreck, looming just beyond the harbor entrance. It gnawed at him, a persistent itch he couldn't ignore. He hadn't slept. The frantic call from Daniel replayed in his mind, a discordant counterpoint to the mystery of the shipwreck. He tried to dismiss both, to revert to his carefully curated life of sun-drenched dives and quiet evenings, but it was impossible. The wreck felt significant, a disruption in the natural order of things. He checked the sea serpent, assessing the damage. A few scraped railings, a cracked window, nothing he couldn't fix. He'd seen worse. He fueled up, loaded extra oxygen tanks, and gathered his gear. Despite the lingering swell, he was going to take a look. "You're crazy, you know that," Fitzwilliam said, watching him prepare. "Going out there after a storm like that. That wreck's been sittin' at the bottom of the Gulf for decades. Let the salvage crews handle it." "Salvage crews aren't going to be discreet," Jack said, his voice flat. He didn't explain why discretion mattered. He barely knew it himself. He ignored Fitzwilliam's further warnings and steered the Sea Serpent out of the marina, the engine straining against the choppy waves. The wreck was closer than he'd thought, rising like a ghostly monolith from the seabed. As he approached, he could make out the shape more clearly. Feuter, likely from World War II, surprisingly intact considering the years it had spent underwater. The storm had scoured away much of the marine growth, revealing patches of faded paint and rusted metal. He dropped anchor a safe distance away and suited up, the familiar ritual grounding him. He checked his air, his dive computer, his safety lines. Every detail mattered. He was alone, and he could trust no one. The descent was eerie. The water was murky, visibility limited to about 20 feet. The wreck loomed larger, a dark and imposing presence in the gloom. He swam closer, cautiously circling the vessel, his flashlight beam cutting through the sediment. The ship's name, partially obscured by rust, was visible on the stern USS Nightingale. A Liberty ship, likely used to transport supplies during the war. He swam along the deck, peering into the darkened holds. He expected to find remnants of wartime cargo sidteeps, ammunition, rations. What he found was something else entirely. Crates. Hundreds of them, stacked neatly in the holds. Wooden crates, reinforced with metal bands, sealed tight. He pried one open with his dive knife. The wood splintered with a satisfying crack. Inside, nestled in layers of oily cloth, were rifles. Old rifles. Lee Enfield bolt action rifles, commonly used by the British during the war. He opened another crate. More rifles, then machine guns, Sten guns, Bren guns, all in remarkably good condition, considering their age. This wasn't a supply ship, it was an armory, a hidden cache of weapons, dumped in the Gulf decades ago. But why, and for whom? He started documenting everything, taking photos with his underwater camera. He needed proof, evidence, something tangible to show someone. Although he wasn't sure who he could trust. As he worked, he had the unsettling sensation of being watched. He scanned the surrounding water, then looked towards the surface. On the beach, partially obscured by the dunes, he saw a figure standing motionless, watching him. Whoever it was, they were too far away to identify. But the feeling of being observed persisted, prickling at the back of his neck. He finished documenting the cargo and began his ascent, his mind racing. He needed to report this, to alert the authorities, but a nagging doubt held him back. He'd learned the hard way that the authorities weren't always on the side of the law. Back on shore, he tried to contact the Coast Guard, then the local sheriff's department. He was met with bureaucratic indifference, a delayed response here, a nonchalant attitude there. They treated his report as the ramblings of a slightly eccentric dive operator. "Look, Mr. Rourke," the sheriff's deputy said, sighing into the phone. "We've had a bad storm. We're dealing with downed power lines, flooded roads, and a whole lot of tourists who've lost their flip-flops, a sunken ship. That is a salvage operation, not a police matter." "These aren't just any artifacts, deputy," Jack insisted. "There are crates of weapons down there. Old weapons, but still functional. They could fall into the wrong hands." Now, Mr. Rourke," the deputy said, his tone patronizing. "Let's not get carried away. They've been underwater for 70 years. What kind of trouble could they possibly cause?" He hung up the phone, frustration simmering. He'd expected this. He'd known better than to trust the system. But he'd hoped, foolishly, that maybe things had changed. His cell phone rang again. This time it was Daniel. "Jack, did you find anything?" "I found a lot," Jack said, his voice grim. "A whole lot of trouble." He briefly recounted his discovery, omitting the part about being watched. He didn't want to involve Daniel any more than he had to. "I told you to stay away from it," Daniel said, his voice tight with anxiety. "That wreck, it is connected to some bad people. People you don't want to mess with." "Who are they?" "It doesn't matter. Just leave it alone, Jack. Let it go." "For Dad's sake." Dad was involved in this. Daniel hesitated. "I don't know, but I know that digging into this won't bring you anything but trouble. Trust me." "I'm not sure I can trust anyone, Daniel. Just, please, Jack, don't make this harder than it already is." The line went dead. He stared at the phone, his hand trembling. Daniel was scared, terrified even, and that fear was contagious. He needed to do more research, find out who owned the Nightingale, track the ship's history, uncover the truth behind the hidden cargo. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. He just didn't know who he could ask. He returned to the marina, the sky now clear and the sun setting in a blaze of orange and gold. He decided to run a quick diagnostic on the sea Serpent before heading home. Something felt off. A subtle vibration, a faint smell of fuel. As he checked the engine, he noticed something else, not cleanly, but hacked at with a dull instrument. Someone had sabotaged his boat, he swore under his breath. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone didn't want him poking around. Someone wanted him to stay away from the wreck. He started to repair the fuel line, meticulously tightening the clamps, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. He had a bad feeling, a sickening premonition that this was just the beginning. He finished the repair and climbed into the cockpit, intending to start the engine and run a full systems check. He turned the key. Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. He opened the engine compartment and discovered the problem. The distributor cap, the essential component that sparked the engine to life, had been completely removed. And stuffed inside, wedged tightly into the housing, was a small, barnacle-encrusted object. He pulled it out. It was a piece of metal, a fragment of a crate, with a faded but unmistakable symbol etched onto its surface, a serpent coiled around a dagger. The insignia of a clandestine organization he thought he'd left behind years ago. The serpent's hand. Before he could react, a wave crashed over the side of the boat, momentarily blinding him. When he could see again, a dark figure was standing on the dock, silhouetted against the setting sun. The figure raised a hand, holding something glinting in the twilight. It wasn't a weapon, not immediately apparent. but it was enough to send a jolt of ice through Jack's veins. It was a single, rusted rifle, a Lee Enfield, plucked straight from the wreck. The chipped formica of the local library felt a world away from the cold steel of the USS Nightingale. Jack spent the entire day poring over microfilms and digitized archives, fueled by stale coffee and a growing sense of unease. The Nightingale hadn't simply disappeared after its decommissioning in 1948. It had been sold to a shadowy Panamanian shipping company, then scrubbed from most official records. He finally struck gold in a forgotten corner of the National Archives, a declassified CIA report from 1952. Operation Nightingale, it was called, a clandestine operation to arm anti-communist forces in Guatemala during the early stages of the Cold War. The Nightingale had been used to run weapons to a rogue CIA operative named Alistair Crompton, a man with a reputation for ruthless efficiency and questionable loyalties. Crompton, the report detailed, was running a shadow war, supporting a paramilitary group intent on overthrowing the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz. The operation was officially denied by the agency when it eventually spiraled out of control, leaving a trail of death and political instability. The report claimed the Nightingale had delivered its last shipment of arms in 1953, then vanished without a trace. The report ended abruptly, with a note stating that all records related to Operation Nightingale had been classified for national security reasons. Jack felt a familiar chill creep down his spine. Classified. The favorite word of those who had something to hide. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his weary eyes. It was all starting to connect. The weapons, the secretive operation, the ship's sudden disappearance. But why surface now, after all these years? And who had deliberately sunk the Nightingale, turning it into a watery tomb? The faces blurred, the sounds distorted. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled his nostrils. He was back in the shipping container, the cold Atlantic pressing in on him. Agent Davies, her eyes wide with terror, reaching for him. He hadn't been fast enough. He never was fast enough. He gasped, jolting awake, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was in his small cottage, the afternoon sun streaming through the window. Sweat soaked his shirt. He hadn't even realized he'd dozed off. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to ground himself. The flashbacks were getting worse, more frequent, more vivid. He hated the way they stole over him, hijacking his thoughts, reminding him of his failure. He'd been diagnosed with PTSD after the Lisbon operation. The doctors had prescribed medication, therapy. He'd tried both, briefly, but the pills made him numb, and the therapy felt like picking at a scab. He'd found solace in the isolation of the Gulf, in the meditative rhythm of diving. But even here, on this sun-drenched coast, the ghosts followed him. He needed to focus. He needed to stay on track. But the weight of the past was crushing him, clouding his judgment. Fitzwilliam had offered to help him with the boat, to run errands, to just be there, but Jack had brushed him off, afraid of getting him involved, afraid of letting anyone get close. He didn't want to drag anyone else into his mess. He knew he was pushing people away. He knew it wasn't healthy, but he couldn't help it. The instinct to isolate, to protect, was too deeply ingrained. It was a survival mechanism, forged in the crucible of Lisbon. He returned to the Nightingale the next morning, the sea calmer, but still restless. He needed to search the ship more thoroughly, to find something poon, anything poon that could explain why this cargo had been hidden in the Gulf for decades. He descended once more, the murky water closing around him like a shroud. He swam through the ship's skeletal remains, systematically exploring each compartment. The cargo holds were mostly empty, stripped bare of their deadly cargo. But in the captain's quarters, hidden behind a false panel in the wall, he found it. A small, watertight compartment. Inside, protected from the ravages of time, was a leather-bound ledger. The pages were brittle and yellowed, filled with meticulous handwritten entries. It was a coded account of Operation Nightingale, detailing the weapons shipments, the payments, the names of the key players. He carefully removed the ledger, sealing it in a waterproof bag. This was it, the missing piece of the puzzle. Evidence that could expose the truth about Crompton, about the CIA's involvement in Guatemala, about the dark secrets hidden beneath the waves. As he began his ascent, a fleeting memory surfaced, a faded photograph from the Lisbon operation, a crate identical to the ones he'd found on the Nightingale. And on the side of the crate, a familiar insignia, the serpent and dagger, the serpent's hand. It couldn't be a coincidence. The Lisbon operation, Operation Nightingale. They were connected, somehow. He just didn't know how. He recalled a crucial piece of evidence that had vanished during the Lisbon raid, a ledger containing details of the arms smuggling ring. It had never been recovered. Had it somehow ended up on the Nightingale? He surfaced, his mind reeling. The implications were staggering. Back at the marina, he was met with a grim sight. Old man Hemmings, the retiree he'd taken on his dive the previous week, was being loaded into an ambulance. "What happened?" Jack asked, rushing over to Fitzwilliam, who was standing nearby, his face etched with sorrow. "They found him floating near the breakers this morning," Fitzwilliam said, his voice barely a whisper. "Drowned. They're saying it was a tragic accident. Heart attack, maybe." Jack didn't believe it. Hemmings was a strong swimmer, a regular at the local pool, and he'd been in good spirits after the dive. Too good. He'd been unusually chatty, asking questions about the wreck, about the area. Had he seen something? Had he overheard something? "The sheriff's department is calling it a drowning," Fitzwilliam continued, shaking his head. "They aren't looking any further." Jack felt a surge of anger. This wasn't an accident. It was a message, a warning. They were silencing anyone who got too close. He forced himself to remain calm. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. He needed to gather more evidence, to build an airtight case. But he knew he was running out of time. They were closing in. He glanced out at the Gulf, the water shimmering under the afternoon sun. The Nightingale lay silent beneath the waves, guarding its secrets. But the secrets wouldn't stay hidden forever. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the echoes of the past were about to reverberate through his present, threatening to consume him entirely. And he was starting to suspect that he wasn't just investigating a shipwreck. He was walking into a trap that had been meticulously laid decades ago, and he was walking into it alone. The ledger's code was a convoluted mess of numbers, symbols, and nautical terms. Jack, a man more comfortable with dive knives and currents than cryptography, was hopelessly lost. He needed an expert. And fast. He found one at the local community college, Sivin Elias Vance. Perpetually caffeinated computer science, student with a reputation for cracking impossible codes. Jack had met Elias a few months back, while giving a presentation on underwater archaeology. The kid had peppered him with questions about data recovery and signal processing. "This is old school," Elias said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Not a complex cipher, but layered. They used a Wegener square combined with a transposition cipher, then overlaid it with nautical flags. Clever, annoying." Hours blurred into a caffeine-fueled frenzy. Jack paced the cramped confines of his cottage, replaying the events of the past few days. The deaths, the sabotage, the chilling realization that he was tangled in something far bigger than a sunken ship. Elias, meanwhile, wrestled with the ledger's secrets, occasionally muttering under his breath. Finally, after 12 hours of relentless work, Elias leaned back, cracking his knuckles. "Got it. I've cracked the key. It is a date, the 17th of July, 1961. That was the Bay of Pigs invasion. I think it is a reference point, a way to tie the code back to the original operation." He ran the code, and the ledger sprang to life, revealing a list of names and coded transactions. Names that made Jack Arthur Penhaligon Sivney, prominent real estate developer in Gulf Shores, known for his lavish contributions to local charities and his close ties to the mayor. Richard Harding Fiven, the sheriff, a man Jack had briefly interacted with, who had dismissed his concerns about the wreck with a wave of his hand. And Julian Voss, once a retired Coast Guard captain, now running a successful charter fishing business. The transactions were equally disturbing. Large sums of money being funneled through offshore accounts, disguised as legitimate business dealings. The code referred to merchandise and deliveries, with quantities matching the number of weapons Jack had found on the Nightingale. "They're not just preserving history," Elias said, his voice subdued. "They're selling it on the black market. I've been running the names through some databases. Penhaligon and Harding both have connections to a known arms dealer operating in South America. Rumor has it he has been supplying a terrorist group in the Middle East." Jack felt a wave of nausea. The Nightingale wasn't a relic of the Cold War. It was the seed of a new conflict. The antique weapons weren't gathering dust on the seabed. They were fueling a modern-day terror network. He accessed his old FBI secure server Cipher, a risky move, but he needed confirmation. A few keystrokes, a bypassed firewall, and he was in. He referenced the names in the ledger with old intelligence reports. The connection was undeniable. Alistair Crompton, the rogue CIA operative behind Operation Nightingale, had been working with a network of influential individuals in the United States, facilitating the illegal arms trade. The network had been dismantled in the 1970s. Or so the official story went. But the ledger proved it had gone underground, resurfaced, and was now thriving. The missing ledger from the Lisbon operation. He remembered the frantic search, the meticulous documentation, the sudden disappearance of the key evidence. It had contained the names of the American facilitators, the silent partners of Crompton's operation, the same names that were now surfacing in the Gulf shores. He felt a cold dread creeping into his heart. He wasn't just dealing with a local conspiracy. He was unearthing a decades-old network of corruption that reached to the highest levels of power. The flashbacks hit him harder now, triggered by the chilling parallel between Lisbon and the current investigation. He saw Agent Davies again, her face pale and terrified, cornered in the warehouse, surrounded by crates of weapons. He remembered the frantic firefight, the overwhelming odds, the feeling of helplessness. He slammed his fist on the table, sending the coffee mug crashing to the floor. He was losing it. The stress, the memories, the constant fear. Ferdy, it was all grinding him down. He needed to talk to someone he could trust. He reluctantly picked up the phone and dialed Daniel. "Jack." Daniel's voice was wary. "What is wrong?" I found something big." He hesitated, unsure how much to tell him. "It involves Dad and Operation Nightingale. I told you to stay away from it," Daniel snapped. "You're playing with fire, Jack. I need your help, Daniel. I can't do this alone. I can't get involved. I have a life now, a family. I can't risk that." "You're protecting them, or yourself, both. Just, please, Jack, walk away, before it is too late." Daniel hung up without another word. Jack stared at the phone. His jaw clenched. He shouldn't have expected anything else. Daniel was always looking out for number one. He needed air. He walked down to the marina. The setting sun casting long shadows across the water. He felt eyes on him, a constant prickling sensation at the back of his neck. He glanced around, but saw nothing. He was getting paranoid. He needed to shake it off. He leaned against the railing, watching the boats bobbing gently in the harbor. A woman was standing a few feet away, sketching in a notepad. She was attractive, early 30s, with dark hair and intelligent eyes. She'd been there for the past hour, seemingly oblivious to his presence. He tried to ignore her, but her gaze kept drifting towards him. Then she closed her notepad and walked towards him, a determined look on her face. "Jack Rourke?" she asked, her voice smooth and professional. He nodded cautiously. "Who are you?" "My name is Sarah Walker. I'm a journalist." She held up a press pass. "I've been doing some research on the Nightingale wreck, and on you." Jack's hand instinctively went to his hip, to the Glock he no longer carried. "What do you want?" "I know about the ledger," she said, her eyes locking with his. "I know about the code, and I know about the weapons." He stared at her, speechless. How could she know? "I've been following the same trail you have," she continued. "I believe this goes deeper than anyone realizes, and I think we need to work together." He scrutinized her face, searching for any sign of deception. "Why should I trust you?" she smiled, a knowing, enigmatic expression. "Rourke, I think we're both in a lot of trouble, and we're running out of time." Before he could respond, a sleek black car pulled up to the dock, the windows tinted. A man in a dark suit stepped out, his face obscured by the shadows. He wasn't looking at Sarah, he was looking at Jack, and he was holding a silenced pistol. "You knew this was coming, didn't you?" Jack asked, adrenaline surging through his veins. The man with the gun hadn't hesitated. He'd moved with the cold efficiency of a professional, clearly expecting resistance. Sarah, remarkably composed, had already ducked behind a stack of lobster traps, her hands flying across her phone. "I suspected someone would try to silence you. I just didn't think it would be so direct." She'd been right. He'd underestimated the lengths they'd go to. He'd allowed himself to become complacent, lulled into a false sense of security. "Police are on their way," she said, glancing up from her phone. "But it'll take them at least 15 minutes to get here." 15 minutes they didn't have. Jack assessed the situation. They were pinned down at a secluded marina a few miles outside Gulf shores, a maze of dilapidated docks and abandoned warehouses. The man with the gun was backed up by two others, heavily armed and wearing tactical gear. They were moving now, flanking the lobster traps, cutting off their escape route. "We need to move," Jack said, his voice low. "Now." He grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward a cluster of fishing boats, weaving between the rotting pilings. His training kicked in Susi, the spatial awareness, the tactical assessment, the instinct for cover and concealment. He hadn't felt this alive, this focused in years. It was terrifying and exhilarating. "Who are these people?" Sarah asked, her voice breathless. "They're working for Alistair Crompton," Jack replied, his eyes scanning the shadows. "The former CIA operative. He is the one running the operation." Sarah had done her homework. "I found a connection between Crompton and a shell corporation based in the Caymans. They've been funneling money to a terrorist cell operating in North Africa. The weapons are destined for them." So it wasn't just about power and influence. It was about global chaos. The realization settled on Jack like a punch to the gut. They reached a small, dilapidated fishing boat, its paint peeling and its engine visibly corroded. Jack hot-wired the engine, his hands moving with practiced ease. He hadn't done this in years, but the skill was ingrained in his muscle memory. "You're full of surprises," Sarah said, watching him work. "I had a different life once," Jack muttered, the engine sputtering to life. He steered the boat towards a secluded cove, using the mangroves for cover. They needed a plan. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. "We need to expose Crompton," Sarah said, her voice determined. "Get the evidence to the authorities, the real authorities, not Harding and his cronies." "Easier said than done," Jack replied. "Crompton has deep pockets and powerful friends. He'll bury us before we even get a chance to talk." "We have the ledger," Sarah pointed out, "and the data I've collected. That is enough to start an investigation." They decided to head to Crompton's primary staging point, IB, an abandoned warehouse on the other side of the marina, where the weapons were being loaded onto a freighter, the Moray. It was a gamble, a direct confrontation, but it was the only way to stop the shipment. The warehouse was a hive of activity. Mercenaries, clad in black uniforms, were swarming over the crates, loading them onto the Moray. Crompton himself was overseeing the operation, a cold, calculating gaze sweeping over the scene. He looked older than Jack had imagined, his face etched with years of ruthlessness and regret. Jack and Sarah approached the warehouse under the cover of darkness, using the shadows as their allies. They moved silently, their movements precise and coordinated. "Remember the plan," Jack whispered. "Distraction, then extraction. We get the evidence, we get out." They breached the warehouse, tossing a smoke grenade. To create confusion, the mercenaries reacted instantly, their weapons blazing. A firefight erupted, the air filled with the crackle of gunfire and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Jack moved like a ghost, utilizing every bit of his training. He took down mercenary after mercenary with precise shots, his movements fluid and efficient. He wasn't enjoying this. He hadn't enjoyed any of it in Lisbon, but he knew he had to do it, to protect Sarah, to stop Crompton, to atone for his past failures. Sarah, surprisingly, was holding her own, providing covering fire and documenting the scene with her camera. She wasn't a soldier, but she was resourceful and courageous. They fought their way through the warehouse, reaching the control room where Crompton was monitoring the operation. He turned at the sound of gunfire, his eyes widening in surprise. "Rourke," he said, his voice laced with venom. "I should have known you'd be involved." "It is over, Crompton," Jack said, his Glock trained on the former CIA operative. "It is time to face the consequences." Crompton chuckled, a cold, mirthless sound. "Consequences. I am the consequences. I've always been the consequences." He reached for a weapon, a hidden pistol concealed under his jacket. But before he could draw it, Jack fired, a single shot precise, lethal. Crompton slumped to the floor, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. But the fight wasn't over. As they secured the control room, a figure emerged from the shadows. Daniel, Jack's brother. He was holding a gun pointed directly at Jack. "Don't move," Daniel said, his voice trembling. Just step away from her." Jack stared at him, stunned. "Daniel, what are you doing?" "I'm protecting the family," he said, his voice tight with desperation. "Crompton, he has leverage. He knows things about Dad, things that could ruin everything. Leverage, you're working with him." Jack couldn't believe it. His own brother betraying him. "I didn't have a choice," Daniel pleaded. He threatened to expose Dad's involvement in Operation Nightingale. Everything he has built would be destroyed. "So you're willing to let him fund terrorists to protect a lie?" Jack asked, his voice filled with disgust. Daniel hesitated, his grip on the gun loosening slightly. I didn't know the whole story. I just wanted to protect Dad." "You're protecting a monster," Sarah said, her voice firm, "and you're making a terrible mistake." Jack knew he had a split-second decision to make. He could try to talk to Daniel, to reason with him, but he didn't have time. The mercenaries were regrouping, closing in on their position. He looked at Daniel, his heart aching with disappointment and betrayal. He saw the fear in his brother's eyes, the desperation. He knew what he had to do. He dropped to the floor, feigning a stumble. As Daniel hesitated, Jack rolled, disarming him with a swift, precise movement. The gun clattered to the floor. "I'm sorry, Daniel," Jack said, pinning his brother to the ground. "But I can't let you do this." The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The authorities were finally arriving. It was over. For now, but Jack knew, with a chilling certainty, that the echoes of the past would continue to haunt him, and that the fight for justice was far from over. The handcuffs felt cold against Daniel's wrists. He didn't resist as Jack secured them, his face a mask of shame and defeat. The arriving officers swarmed the warehouse, taking control of the scene, rounding up the remaining mercenaries. Sarah was already on the phone, coordinating with the FBI, relaying the information they'd uncovered. "I didn't want this, Jack," Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper. "You have to believe me." Jack knelt beside him, his jaw tight. "Then you shouldn't have made a deal with Crompton." "I had no choice." He knew about Dad's contributions to the foundation, the illegal funding, the falsified reports. He said he'd expose everything, ruin Dad's legacy, if I didn't cooperate. The story, as Daniel confessed under questioning, was a tangled web of blackmail and betrayal. Their father, a respected philanthropist and local businessman, had been a silent partner in Crompton's operation for decades, providing financial cover and logistical support. When Crompton had been forced into hiding after Operation Nightingale, their father had continued to funnel money to him, believing it was his patriotic duty. Then Crompton resurfaced, demanding more. He threatened to reveal their father's involvement unless Daniel helped him establish his network and smuggle the weapons. Daniel, desperate to protect his family's reputation, had reluctantly agreed. "He used me, Jack," Daniel sobbed. "He used all of us." Jack listened in silence, his emotions a swirling vortex of anger, disappointment, and pity. He'd always suspected something was amiss with their father. The man had been distant, secretive, always shrouded in an air of self-importance, but he'd never imagined the extent of his complicity. Sheriff Harding, looking pale and shaken, approached them. "Rourke, what the hell is going on here?" "Your deputy was on Crompton's payroll, Harding," Jack said, his voice steely. "So was Penhaligon, and a lot of other people in this town." Harding stared at him, his jaw slack. This can't be true." "It is, Sheriff," Sarah interjected, handing him a file containing the evidence she'd gathered. "We have proof, bank records, coded communications, witness statements. It is all there." The sheriff's face crumpled. He knew he was finished. Jack was left with a difficult decision. He could arrest Daniel, book him as an accomplice to Crompton's crimes. It was the right thing to do, the legal thing to do, but it would destroy his family. His father, already frail and ailing, wouldn't survive the scandal. He looked at Daniel, his eyes pleading for understanding. He saw the regret, the remorse. He saw a broken man. "I can't," Jack said finally, his voice barely audible. "I can't let you go, but I can ensure you get a fair hearing, and I can make sure your father is protected." He pulled some strings, contacted his old colleagues at the FBI, and negotiated a plea bargain for Daniel, reduced charges, a lighter sentence, and a guarantee of immunity for their father. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best he could do. The final confrontation with Crompton took place at the docks, as they prepared to transfer him to federal custody. The former CIA operative, stripped of his power and influence, was a shadow of his former self. He stood defiantly, a hardened glint in his eyes. "You think you've won, Rourke," he sneered. "You think you've stopped me? This is just a setback. The world needs people like me, people willing to do what is necessary to protect their interests." "You're a monster, Crompton," Jack said, his voice cold. "You used and manipulated people for your own selfish gain. You funded terrorism, and you destroyed lives." Crompton shrugged. "A necessary evil. There is no justification for what you've done." As the federal agents moved to escort Crompton away, Jack paused, a sudden thought striking him. He remembered a detail from the ledger, a coded reference to Project Nightingale II. "What is Project Nightingale II?" he asked, his voice sharp. Crompton's face darkened. He hesitated, then let out a bitter laugh. "You're a persistent one, Rourke, I'll give you that." He refused to answer, maintaining his silence. As the agents led him away, he locked eyes with Jack, a chilling promise in his gaze. "You haven't heard the last of this, Rourke," he said. "Not by a long shot." The dust settled, and the investigation began to unravel the full extent of the conspiracy. The corrupt officials were arrested, the illegal funds were seized, and the weapons were secured. Jack testified before a grand jury, laying bare the truth about Crompton's operation. It was a cathartic experience, a way to finally put his past demons to rest. Sarah, meanwhile, was working on a series of articles exposing the scandal. She'd become a trusted ally, a voice of reason and integrity in a world of darkness and deceit. They were celebrating their victory at the dive shop, sharing a quiet drink, when Sarah showed Jack something she'd discovered while sifting through Crompton's financial records. "I found something," she said, her brow furrowed in concentration. A series of transactions routed through a Swiss bank account to a company called Hydra Corp. "Hydra Corp?" Jack asked, a nagging sense of unease creeping over him. "It is a shell corporation, but it is linked to a private military contractor operating in Eastern Europe," Sarah explained. "They specialize in cyber warfare." She showed him a screenshot of a document detailing a substantial payment to Hydra Corp, labeled Project Cerberus. Jack stared at the document, his blood running cold. The name Cerberus, the three-headed dog guarding the gates of the underworld. It felt ominous, a warning of something far more dangerous lurking beneath the surface. "Crompton wasn't just selling weapons," he said, his voice low. "He was building something bigger." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with concern. "I think we just scratched the surface, Jack, and I have a feeling the real storm is still to come." She turned to him, her expression serious. "This isn't just about a smuggling operation anymore. This could be about a new kind of war." Daniel's testimony was the key that unlocked everything. Reluctantly, but thoroughly, he laid bare his father's decades, long involvement with Crompton, detailing the intricate web of deceit and the elaborate financial schemes they'd concocted. Facing a mountain of evidence, elected to cooperate, hoping for leniency. It was a painful reckoning for the family, a public unraveling of a carefully constructed legacy. The fallout was swift and decisive. Penhaligon and Harding, stripped of their positions and facing numerous charges, became cautionary tales. The flow of weapons was cut off, averting a potential terrorist attack. The FBI secured the remaining caches, and the international investigation into Hydra Corp was launched. For the first time in years, Jack felt a flicker of something resembling peace. The immediate crisis was over. The ghosts of Lisbon hadn't vanished entirely, but they'd receded, their grip on his psyche loosening slightly. He'd started attending therapy sessions, reluctantly at first, but gradually finding solace in the process. Dr. Ellis, a kind, perceptive woman, helped him confront his trauma, to acknowledge his guilt, and to forgive himself. He also made an effort to reconnect with the community. He volunteered at the local Boys and Girls Club, teaching diving skills to underprivileged kids. He started attending town hall meetings, offering his expertise on coastal preservation. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He was rebuilding, brick by brick, a life worth living. Sarah's exposé, published in a national investigative journalism magazine, was a bombshell. The Serpent's hold. Corruption and conspiracy in the Gulf shores sent shockwaves through the political establishment. The article detailed the intricate network of corruption, exposing the complicity of powerful figures and the devastating consequences of their greed. She became a target, receiving death threats and facing relentless attacks from those seeking to discredit her. But she stood her ground, unwavering in her commitment to the truth. Jack, quietly, provided her with security, ensuring her safety. Their bond, forged in the crucible of danger, had deepened into a quiet understanding, a mutual respect. "You did good, Jack," she said, as they sat on the beach one evening, watching the sun sink below the horizon. "You took down a monster and saved a lot of lives." "We did good," Jack corrected, his voice soft. "It was a team effort, but the piece wouldn't last." Buried within the seized files from Crompton's operation, Sarah had found something disturbing. A series of coded files referencing a shadow operation dating back to the 1980 Sign. Ghost signals. "These files are," she said, showing Jack a digital scan of the documents. They refilled with nautical charts, sonar readings, and transcripts of strange radio transmissions. It is like they were tracking something underwater. She'd managed to decode a significant portion of the data, revealing a pattern of unexplained disappearances in the Gulf Shores area. Fishermen, boaters, even tourists, signboard, all vanished without a trace, leaving behind no wreckage, no bodies, no clues. "At first, I thought it was just a series of tragic accidents," Sarah said, her voice troubled. "But the timing coincides with these ghost signals and the coordinates on these charts. They all center around a particularly deep section of the Gulf, about 50 miles offshore." Jack felt a shiver crawl down his spine. He remembered Fitzwilliam's stories about the ghost fleet, the eerie tales of shipwrecks and spectral sightings. Could there be a connection? "The files also mention a research facility," Sarah continued. "A clandestine operation conducted by a rogue element within the Navy. They were experimenting with advanced sonar technology, supposedly for detecting submarines. But the details are vague, and the project was abruptly shut down in the early 1990s. He recalled a rumor he'd heard years ago, during his FBI days. A black ops project involving experimental underwater weaponry. It had been dismissed as a conspiracy theory at the time, but now, "I think Crompton was involved in this project," Jack said, his voice grim. "I think he was using the weapons shipments to fund it, and I think he was concealing something down there." "Something big," Sarah agreed, her eyes filled with apprehension. The revelation cast a long shadow over the town. The local fishermen, already rattled by the recent events, were uneasy. Old man Fitzwilliam, his face etched with worry, recounted tales of strange lights and unexplained disturbances in the water. "There is something unnatural out there. Son," he rasped, "I've been fishing these waters for 60 years. I know when something ain't right." Then the call came. It was from Deputy Miller, the new sheriff, a decent man struggling to restore order after Harding's scandal. "Jack, we got a report from Old Man Hemmings," Miller said, his voice urgent. "He claims he saw something unusual off the coast this morning, an unmarked submarine just beneath the surface." Jack's heart sank. A submarine. What was a submarine doing in these waters? And what did it have to do with the ghost signals and the unsolved disappearances? "Hemmings is a reliable witness," Miller continued. "He said it was dark, sleek, and didn't have any visible markings. He only saw it for a few seconds, but he is convinced it wasn't a US Navy vessel." Jack exchanged a look with Sarah. The pieces were falling into place, forming a dark and disturbing picture. Crompton hadn't been acting alone. He'd been part of something bigger, something hidden beneath the waves. "I'm heading out there," Jack said, grabbing his gear. "I want to see for myself." "Be careful, Jack," Miller warned. "This could be dangerous." As Jack prepared to launch the Sea Serpent, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was diving into the darkness. Once more, the piece he'd found was fragile, ephemeral. A new threat had emerged, lurking beneath the surface, its intentions unknown. The ghosts of the past were stirring, and this time they were bringing something far more terrifying with them. He glanced out at the Gulf, the water shimmering under the moonlight. Somewhere out there, In the inky blackness, something was watching, waiting, and Jack knew, with a chilling certainty, that the hunt had just begun.